So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. The work that I'm about to present is literally the work of probably 50 people, and I'm only the spokesperson for that effort. I have to say that that the MRCT Center, which I'll describe in a second, is supported by a number of gifts and grants, but we are responsible for our content and have autonomy in the work, and you can see where our funding is from. I have no personal conflicts of interest with this presentation. So the MRCT Center is a research and policy center, as was said, that really focuses on the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical trials with the purpose of improving the integrity, safety, and rigor. We do that with some academic credibility and hopefully, and as a neutral convener. How we do that work is to engage diverse stakeholders from all the key stakeholders involved in clinical research. That's, pharma companies, CROs, academicians, patient advocates, regulatory folks, and others, depending on the question that we're addressing, and making sure that we work to create actionable, ethical, and practical solutions. We're not a white paper shop, but really want to deliver tools, and we're affiliated with both the Brigham and Harvard. We have a number of different kinds of focuses, and I'm going to be talking today on the health literacy effort that we've done over the last year and a half on clinical trials. But I thought it's worth mentioning how this work came about, which is that we had initially a number of years ago really focused on return of individual and aggregate summary results to participants. It's an unmet need, and participants really would like to get the results of their clinical trial participation and almost never do. That's something that could be changed, and we focused on that, and in so doing realized that whatever communication we were recommending at the end of a clinical trial or in individual clinical results should be health literate to the audience that we were directing them to. And that led us to analyze the clinical trial pathway. And if you think about it, a clinical trial sort of starts with some new idea and then a planned study design. There's IRB and other regulatory considerations. Then you work to identify and recruit the patients or the participants. I don't use the word subjects unless I'm talking about the regulations, because they are participants. There's a period of collecting data, and then the patient ends their time. Sometime after that, the study ends, there's data analysis, and then communicating the results. So we had focused on the summary results. What we realized clearly was that there was an informed consent, which was a huge part of this. I'm not going to say anything about the informed consent process because Chris Trudeau is going to address that, as are others today. But even before that, there's education of the individual, education of the public, education of the community, which actually precedes any sort of specific interaction in a given trial, and it should precede it so people come with some understanding of what clinical research is, and it continues throughout the rest of their time on trial. And further, there's a health literate part of data collection, research procedures, and communicating what is necessary for the integrity of the study. And finally, there's communicating individual study results. So all of this is part of how we consider health literacy in clinical trials, from access and information in advance of anyone getting sick to the end of the clinical trial when you communicate their individual and summary results. So I'm not going to tell this audience about health literacy. I've been chastised to say that I cannot have a definition of health literacy lest I, am in the line of fire of the roundtable. I'm also not going to tell you about how health literacy is a problem. But I do want to mention that, even though we may talk about low health literacy or there is a difference in the fact that white participants have a low health literacy essentially of 28%, while 65% of Hispanic adults are said to be basic or below basic health literacy. Whether that's true or not, or dependent upon English as a first language and all other kinds of information, what is important is that we're challenging participation of a very diverse group of people into our trials by not being health literate in the way that we approach it. And further, this is reflected in the fact that clinical trials in the U.S. lack appropriate diverse representation, and we don't know the role of health literacy in promoting that inequity. It's the other project we're doing this year, and one that we feel passionate about. It is an international priority. Again, I'm not going to go through what the WHO has said about it. All I will say is that the WHO has not made clinical research or clinical trials a priority area, and if you go through the entire document and every other document they've put out on sustainable goals, clinical research does not appear. Huge problem. So with that, we sort of set the stage that when we think about health literacy, who needs to be around the table? Well, certainly the funders, the sponsors, investigators, and study teams, and individuals representing the IRBs, the institutional review boards, because all of those cooperate to create health literate study materials. Those are all created hopefully with the participation of potential participants, but before you get to the actual participants, so participants need to be there as our caregivers and families, and if there is collaboration around that, we're hopeful that health literate communication will increase trust in the system. So again, we use that to develop the guidelines around who we would try to recruit for a health literate health literacy project. And you can see that about 50 people volunteered to participate. Really a remarkable number of people that, sort of stood up to help us on this work. And I have to call out Sylvia Badoff-Cassis, who's in the audience, who's the project manager and manages all the 50 people. And of course, Chris Trudeau and Lori Myers and the MRCT team who does and is the leadership here. So, and this was a very deliberative process. We scoped the process. We made sure that we had a multi-dimensional definition. This is not about plain language only. This is about numeracy, visualization, navigation, cultural competencies, and design, and sort of developing a system that from the outset becomes a health literate product. And again, trying to develop some actionable tools. So, and again, I've been forewarned that I shouldn't give you a lecture about how this is not a moment of blaming the victim, and it's not the responsibility of the person receiving the information to try and make sense of it. It is clearly the communicator is responsible for making sure that the information that they communicate is understood by the target audience. And I would say that the target audience, whoever that is receiving the information, should also be in a setting where they're comfortable saying they don't understand and saying they need to go over it again and saying that, and they're comfortable not knowing, which is not the case currently. And beyond the two communicator axis, it's a systems problem. We don't invest in making health literate communications. We don't invest in training and education. And the people in this room are the health literacy experts, not the investigators and the research personnel, largely. Not entirely, but largely. So why we think it's foundational to the ethical conduct of clinical research. The very foundation of how we approach clinical research is voluntary informed consent. In the absence of demonstrated understanding, how can you really know that somebody is committing informed consent in a voluntary way? And then there's equitable access to research, which I discussed in brief. But I'm not convinced that the majority of investigators or their institutions have embraced this concept, nor the IRBs. Consider it their responsibility to provide oversight to health literate communications. And funders on this have been largely, not entirely, but largely silent. And there are resourcing implications. There's time, money, and people that need to be invested in this process. But I go beyond the ethical to say that it is also important for scientific integrity of the trial and the generalizability of the research. So if you do not have a diverse participation in the trial, you do not know how generalizable the results of that trial will be. And our trials should reflect the population that will be affected by the disease and likely to participate in whatever intervention is being studied. Better communication will also enhance compliance and thus data validity. If people don't understand what they're supposed to do in a research procedure or for their follow-up care, they can't possibly comply with those expectations. And I would posit that it's also better for retention if somebody really feels that they understand why they're contributing to science and what they get out of it. So the clinical trial life cycle, health literacy is a critical need. We think that it goes from discovery, from access, education, all the way through to the end of study and communication. And clear communication is essential throughout. But we would go somewhat further. We posit that beyond health literacy, we should strive to ensure clinical trial literacy. People can understand the health implications and still not be comfortable with the words and the concepts and the underlying clinical trial expectations and assumptions. So what does it look like? So building relationships with and developing the general research information for the community of interest. It starts with access and education and moves towards thoughtful and multi-format study-specific recruitment materials and procedures. I'm not talking about a written informed consent. I'm talking about the process. I'm talking about thinking about informed consents in a different way. We are living in a way, in a world of YouTubes and other formats, and we should be availing ourselves of visual methodologies. I think we should provide detailed study information to support informed decision-making, and then provide for study participation materials that are appropriate. Finally, that supports the end-of-study communications and information sharing, and ideally you would know your target audience at that point and be able to do that appropriately. But the information that you gather from the participants throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial should then feed into making your next iteration better. And further, it is not something that is one way, it is two-way, and these are not linear, they're rather dynamic. But bilateral engagement with the participants and partnerships with those participants are always of benefit. You learn more from talking to the participants or potential participants than you do sitting down with a dictionary, although I love dictionaries. So if we think about this, we've done a lot of different work, and I'm going to fly through some of that. We focused on access and education and developing patient-facing materials and resources. We did this with the Harvard CTSA, the Harvard Catalyst. We developed a number of different brochures that are all health literate and all reviewed by IRBs and have gone through health literate, sort of revisions by professionals that are comfortable. They're all available for download, and they've been translated into 15 languages. And if you look at them, they take the brochure type, and we've translated them into appropriate translations with collaborators in the relevant countries to make sure that the translation works well. So 25 brochures, 15 languages. You're invited to see them, criticize them, tell us what we should do more and what further brochures or other we should develop. And I want to say that there is plain language dictionaries. United Health Group has done an unbelievably brilliant job of making available a 17,000 word dictionary or sort of lexicon, and that's translated into Spanish and Portuguese. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. This is freely available, and I thank Steve Ryan for pointing it out to me, and he will be happy to talk to folks about this. I do think that plain language is essential but not sufficient. We need to also translate the kinds of terms we see in clinical trials. If you tell somebody that it's a non-inferiority trial, they look at you blank. So we have now started to invest in developing a schedule or a sequence of clinical trial terms that are used almost exclusively in clinical trials so that we can couple that with some of these other efforts. I also think that numeracy is incredibly important, and it's not just creating a way of expressing things that are easy for people to understand, like a pie chart. When you say 1 in 20% or 1 in 5 patients, the tumors got at least 30% smaller. I also think it's important to say in 80% or 4 out of 5, the tumors did not get at least 30% smaller. And if you only show one and not both, there's sort of an implicit bias that we need to be careful of. So what does it look like? Here's an older consent form. We want fewer documents like that and more like this. You've seen, I'm sure, 100 examples of this around the roundtable, but I can tell you that almost all our documents currently look like the former. And similarly, if you look at study procedures and how one should be doing study procedures and give this kind of information sheet to a patient, they're going to look at it like it's a set of instructions and toss it. If you give them something that is easier to follow, and this comes from Merck and the health literacy media as an example, we think these kinds of things are actually very, very helpful. So it's clear that this is a rising appreciation of the patient participation and how they can help us become, sort of make our trials more patient-centric and how the patient voice in what we do matters. I think that what we need to say is that if you work with the community and use their language, by default, you're more likely to be health literate in your communications. And that is from a medical work group member who works with us closely. So I also want to emphasize that this is a systems approach. It's not up to the communicator, it's not up to the communicated, but there needs to be a corporate and individual commitment to communication, and I would argue participant engagement throughout the process. Trials are engineered to deliver results, and they should be engineered to deliver results that are important to participants and patients and their loved ones and to society, not because it's the investigator's favorite question. And the process, like any other, requires dissection, analysis, and re-engineering, and that goes beyond plain language terms, their use and meaning in the culture in which they will be used, design, numeracy, and visualization, and then education and training of all the individuals involved, something we don't focus on enough. A commitment to provide the resources required by the relevant stakeholders, tools and resources that need not be invented to simplify the process, iterative quality improvement when you know what you're looking at and for, to measure it, improve it, and try it again, and then incentive structures for the right behaviors. For instance, we currently have on our CVs, anybody who starts a clinical trial lists that clinical trial on their CV. I feel strongly that if you don't finish the clinical trial, it's putting patients at risk without possibility of benefit. And why we let them put that on their CV and not, in manuscript and preparation is one of those kinds of things that we could easily or readily change. So coming soon, we're developing a website which is going to be hopefully helpful in terms of providing those kinds of resources that will be useful. It has a set of principles behind it and behind the work we do, which is all developed communally with everyone. There are resources for research participants and the publics, and those very brochures that I showed you that are flat, sort of visual, written products are going to be translated into voiceover PowerPoints and more digestible methods to communicate. There is going to be sections, or we're building sections on each of those subsections that we've been talking about, not because they don't all hang together at the end, but because there are specific tools for each of those as you think about them that you should be familiar with and help with. There will be a section on consent, which, as I say, I'm not going to talk about because Chris will, and a focus on end of study. As I said when I began this, we spent a lot of time on the communication of results, and we're now going to make this easier still by creating the tools to make it available for everyone. So please contribute. If you have tools, resources, stories that will help enhance this, this is a communal piece of work. It's not ours. We're just doing some of the infrastructure background for it. We really would love to hear from you. Again, huge thanks to Sylvia, Lori, and Chris. Thank you.